where we empower survivors' voices and challenge the status quo. I am your host, Kelly Humphreys, survivor, advocate, author, speaker, researcher, ambassador, and a seasoned former first responder. Supported by the team at Media 8, Off the Cuff with Kel is about growth and healing, leadership through trauma, awareness and understanding. We bring you compelling stories of courage, transformation and expert insights, along with candid discussions on the challenges victims and survivors face. Off the Cuff with Kel celebrates our shared humanity, blending deep vulnerability with humour. Each episode is crafted with love, honesty and the emotions that bind us, whether it's laughter or tears, promoting resilience and hope. Please note, some of the discussions we have can be hard to hear and include sexual abuse themes, online exploitation, domestic and family violence and trauma. So, listener discretion is advised. Please join us as we change the world one story at a time, embracing courage through vulnerability. All right, guys, welcome to Off the Cuff with Kel. We're at episode number 29. I'm so excited to be on here tonight because I've got this really cool chick. Caitlin Roper is here with me live on a topic that I'm actually really scared to talk about. So that's why I brought her in. She's amazing. She is the author of Sex Dolls, Robots, and Women Hating. Campaign manager for Collective Shout, a freelance writer, activist, and all-around warrior for survivors and those who've experienced abuse. And so we welcome you tonight, Caitlin. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
I am, as I said, I was a little bit, look, I'm just going to, look, it's off the cuff, so that means, like, you know, there's no kind of script here, and I'm just going to be really vulnerable, and I did share this a little bit earlier, and that is I don't actually know a whole lot about child sex dolls. I really don't. It kind of freaks me out a little bit, and I think that's why I don't know much about it, because I haven't kind of explored what this kind of looks like. I know how I feel about it, but I'm really interested to tap into this because I think there's a lot of misconception in this space, and I think there's a lot more going on here than I think we'd like to think. And so I'm actually really, I want to say excited is probably not the word, like I'm very curious, and I want to bust this open and like face this head on. So I'm going to lean on you a little bit tonight, Caitlin. Usually I'm the one that's like, yep, I'm all over this, and tonight I'm not. So please, I'd love you to tell us why this is so important to you, and then tell us a little bit about the scope of what we're dealing with here.
Sure. So again, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this stuff and I guess help people to get a better understanding of what's actually going on, because I think a lot of people are just kind of horrified by this, and rightly so. But it is also really important to talk about it and talk about what needs to be done, what we can be doing. So I've been researching sex dolls and robots and child sex abuse dolls for several years now. And like I said, I've written a book, Sex Dolls, Robots, and Women Hating, The Case for Resistance. And I guess because of my, I have been working with Collective Shout for a world free of sexploitation for almost 15 years now. So that's, lots of different arenas of sexploitation, I suppose, whether it's the pornography industry or the sex trade, or things like sexist advertising or child abuse and sexualization, all these things, or this very broad kind of sexploitation. But like I said, I've had this interest in sex dolls for the last few years. And what I've come to learn about them is it's really quite disturbing. But I think my interest came from, well, like a lot of people in this space, there's a personal investment, personal experiences, and seeing what it's like, particularly for women and girls, also for boys, but just the experiences that you go through and the way that culture sort of responds and everything. And also as a mother of 3 kids myself, when I first started this work, I had 3 young kids. Now they're 3 older kids. But you start to see the world again through a different lens. Like once you're an adult, you're sort of seeing things as an adult, but once you have kids and you go back a little bit and kind of be, oh, what are they seeing every day, and what is this like for them? So you'd see things like pornified advertising or sexist lad mags at the checkout, and all these things that I was suddenly aware that my kids are being exposed to these messages about women, and this is their role, that women are sexual objects, that they exist to be looked at, they exist for men's sexual use and abuse, or that they just are decorative. But messages undermining the full humanity of women and girls, which was really at odds with what I was trying to teach my kids. So that's really how I started to get quite passionate about this. And from there, obviously the work with Collective Shout, and from there, more specifically, sex dolls, robots, and child sex abuse dolls. And I think the child sex abuse dolls in particular, because it's just so, it's a really hard topic. It's quite confronting a lot of the time, and it's the kind of thing where part of me wants to sort of like yell and tell everyone that this is what's happening. You don't know what's happening, but it's also because it's so confronting. It's really hard to have some of these conversations because it is upsetting for people, and people have their own sort of, own issues going on that they might need to sort of not be exposed to this information or this content. So it's a bit of a tricky one, because I do feel strongly that something needs to be done, that things need to be done. We need to be having these conversations, but it's also, it's a hard topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's not something I've particularly allowed myself to explore, I think, and because I've just had this, I think your book title, did you say The Resistance? Is that, what's your subtitle of the book?
Case for Resistance.
A Case for Resistance, yeah. And actually, well, it's very clever, because I think I've been resistant. I mean, I've got enough to deal with in this space and the work that I'm doing anyway, but it was only recently I was doing an interview with somebody, and we'd mentioned about child sex dolls and importing and all that sort of stuff, and I just thought, I really don't know enough about what's happening here. And then, I saw some documentaries and things, and I was like, oh shit, like this is insane. But how I felt about that as a victim survivor myself, and just knowing the small things that I've kind of seen and heard about what child sex dolls represent, it made me feel sick to my stomach, but it sort of undermined my kind of experience. Like, I don't know how to sort of explain that, except to say that the way that sex dolls are represented, and how men particularly will treat a sex doll, and what that does to then a real lived experience. So I'd love you if you could perhaps go into a bit about what particularly child sex dolls are, and what the sort of debate is around that whole issue of, that it's okay. It's okay. It's just a doll, right? It's just a doll. So yeah, I'd love you to talk about them. Yeah.
Sure. So I use the term child sex abuse dolls because I think it sort of more accurately describes what they actually are for, and it sort of reflects, like, symbolically what's being done to them, what's being enacted on them. So child sex abuse dolls, these are lifelike, anatomically correct silicone dolls made in the likeness of children, toddlers, and even babies, and they're marketed for men's sexual use. So they come with penetrable orifices, typically. This is vaginal, oral, and anal, and these are designed to accommodate an adult male's penis. They're almost all girls, in my experience, female-bodied, modeled on little girls. I've come across hundreds of these products over the last few years, and really only a handful of them have ever been male-bodied when we're looking at the child dolls. So that's what they are. Basically, some of the debates going on, well, there's sort of like a little subset of academia which sort of is studying pedophilia and some of these topics, and argues that, maybe we don't have the research yet, we don't have the empirical data yet, maybe child sex abuse dolls could actually be helpful because pedophiles could use a doll rather than acting out sexually abusing a child. So that's the suggestion that's out there, that this could actually be worth looking into, could be worth exploring. It could mean that these men have a sexual outlet so they're not going to sexually abuse children. Everything that I have read and researched, and the media reports that I've documented, and common sense would suggest this is not how that works, that we don't challenge child sexual abuse by giving pedophiles replica children to practice on. That if you encourage and normalize the sexual abuse of children and the sexual objectification of little girls and legitimize it, essentially, that this is going to be helpful. So yeah, there's a whole lot there, really, and ways that, of course, that can make things much worse for children, because like I said, it's not just not preventing sexual abuse, but it's normalizing and encouraging and going potentially in terms of escalation. We know in a lot of these cases there are patterns of escalation. So sometimes an offender might start by consuming CSAM and progress over time to acting out on a physical child contact offending. So we know when we have a child sex abuse doll, the idea is, if you look at what that is, it's already an escalation, because they're going from viewing already going to physically acting out on a replica child. So it's already like a progression, already an escalated form of engaging with CSAM. So the idea that this is helpful or preventative, it's not borne out in the evidence. It just doesn't make logical sense.
I think it makes sense only for those who aren't willing to think more about it, perhaps. And I was just going to say, I think for so many people who are a little bit ignorant in this space, or think that it doesn't matter to them or doesn't apply, unless you're willing to take a moment to actually digest this information and think about it, I think it's easy to just kind of write it off and go, oh yeah, well, it's just another thing that they can do. And I can see where that naive assumption would come from, if you're not willing to actually have a think about how this could impact your kids or the people around you, for instance. I think just also before we go any further, for those who are listening, CSAM is child sexual abuse material, and it's basically abuse that is filmed or documented or depicted in some way, or text, which is what the legal definition is. And so Caitlin's saying that, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but acting out on child sex dolls is a step up from the child sexual abuse material being online, and engaging and watching that material and watching that abuse, which is in varying levels. There's varying categories of online exploitation and abuse. And child sex abuse dolls give perpetrators the ability to let loose, I guess. That's probably a really bad way to put it, but they can really enact any sexual fantasy they want on a childlike doll. And correct me if I'm wrong, but can't you custom make these according to a particular child? Like, you can make it look like one of your own children, perhaps, or somebody else's child, or is that right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a number of things that buyers can do. So they can just buy a doll as is. They can just be like, I just want that one, I'll just buy it. Or something else which is really common in sex dolls in general is the option to customize. So that might mean you choose the body type and the skin tone, the hair and eye color, all these details. Some of the details are really like fingernails and freckles and things like that. So you can really, down to every very minute degree, customize a doll. But then some doll sellers go even further, where they say you can send in a photo of the child you want your doll to look like, and we will customize, we'll make that doll for you. So we've actually, at Collector Shout, exposed this happening on Etsy and on Made in China. So two major global online platforms where sellers are offering this. And there's also a number of child sex abuse doll manufacturers, just not on these sort of mainstream platforms, that offer this service as well. So it is happening, it is a thing. And again, when people say, oh, it's better that they use a doll than a real child, it's like, well, it gets murky, because it's not like these two separate and distinct things, like over here is a doll and over here is a child, and there's nothing else happening. There's a lot of overlap, and children are still being harmed by men's use of sex dolls.
Well, isn't it like I'm just kind of thinking past this now. So you've got this picture of a child, like, so a child cannot give consent anyway, right? But I'm just kind of thinking if somebody's just like, oh, there's this random picture, or a picture of a child within their family they're sending off, or an adult sex doll of a woman potentially that doesn't know that their image has been taken, or there's basically a replica of the child or the woman being made in their image that they don't know about. So I'm just my head's going. I like, if those exploding head emojis, because that's kind of what's happening to my brain right now. Just trying to think about, like, there's no consent there. There's no ability for any agency or control from the victim of this.
It really is such a violation. I did.
My brain. Sorry.
In my book, I included the accounts of a couple of women who learned that sex dolls had been made in their likeness without their consent. So one of them, she got a message on Instagram, and it was someone saying, "This sex doll looks like you," and she sort of ignored it. And then she got another message later, and it was like, "Here is the picture, and it's based on her." With a link to her Instagram account saying it's based on this woman, and we've given the doll this woman's name because it's made of her. And another woman talked about how a man had messaged her and said, I love using my doll that's made of you. And it had like sort of her fringe and all these kind of little features that was sort of unique to her. And that's how he had it customized. And just the distress that these women feel, the absolute violation by having, like, it's not their body, but it is their body. It is their likeness being used for men's sexual gratification in a way that they don't have any control over. And it's really upsetting for these women. And, I don't think that the laws are really catching up to the ways that technology can be used to facilitate this kind of abuse of women.
Yeah. So is there any kind of link that you know of in your research between, so like a replica doll, and then actually then taking and be like, oh, you know what, this isn't actually enough anymore, and then going on to then contact offend?
Well, what I will say is I've been documenting cases in the media where men are found in possession with child sex abuse dolls or trying to import them, and they are almost always in possession of other child abuse material. So usually video images, thousands of them typically. So they're already sexually offending against children. So this idea that having a doll will prevent that, that's not what's happening. Some of them are also contact offending. Some of them are doing other things like covert filming children and things like that. But they're already sexually offending against children. And some of them are actually incorporating children, like actual children known to them, into their sex doll use. So I'll give you one example. This was a teacher, a primary school teacher in Victoria, and he had these child sex abuse dolls, and he dressed them in school uniform, and he would put masks on the dolls made of photos printed out of his students. And he also took pornographic videos and superimposed the face of him and one of his child students in those videos. So some people might say, oh, better a doll or better pixels than a real child, but it's like, that's not what is happening. Like, can anyone really make an argument that that is not harmful, that those children aren't still being exploited and violated when their image, their likeness is used in that way?
Yeah, I don't like, I don't, yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with this, because I'm just thinking about how, well, I already, obviously, I do research, and I'm working with CSAM victims and survivors, and I hear their stories, and I hear, their voices in terms of, not feeling safe to come forward and to talk about what's happened. And, it's a lot of that loss of agency and control, particularly when there's pictures put out about them that they don't know about, right? And I kind of feel like this is a little bit the same as that. And I really struggle with the fact that, it just to me, it undermines a victim's experience by normalizing the behavior of having a child sex doll, if that make sense.
Mm.
That's how I feel. That's for me as a survivor going, oh, this, why am I uncomfortable with this? Why is this causing me, issues in my stomach where I want to kind of throw up? It's because it's of this personal violation where I'm thinking, well, how can it be okay? How can that be okay? And the impact that it has on, I mean, I'm just one survivor. There's so many of it. We're 28% of the population. Trying to come to terms with why this should be okay, why this is normalized, why is it acceptable? And if that's acceptable, then what else are we going to accept?
Mm. And it gives legitimacy to it, really, doesn't it? Because it sort of makes it okay. It makes it tolerable, rather than saying, no, we actually value children. We don't tolerate this. We're not going to accept this, rather than this should be encouraged. We should be doing this. We should do more of this because this is the way forward. This is a solution. It just doesn't make sense.
No. So what is the legislation in Australia? We're filming from Australia. I mean, globally, this show could be anywhere, but we're coming from Australia, so I'm very interested in what Australia says. But I guess a little bit, if you know kind of the stance around the world, I'd be very interested in how that kind of is different and why.
Yeah, so Australia is sort of a bit more progressive on this issue than a lot of places in the world. We have our combating child sexual exploitation legislation, which was amended to, so basically, and you might jump in as well and add what you know, because I'm sure you have some unique insight that I don't. So expanded the definition of child pornography and child pornography material to include childlike sex dolls. So what it did is it made an offence to possess, to advertise, order, post, and import a child sex abuse doll or a part of a child sex abuse doll. So determining what a child sex abuse doll is, it gets a little bit sort of vague, but it must resemble a person who appears to be under 18, and it must be sort of obviously for sexual use. And I believe it also has to be, to prove it in court, it has to be like intentional. So I do recall one case, I think it was a man in Canberra, where he was charged for importing a child sex abuse doll. And his argument, his defense was, I didn't intentionally buy a child sex abuse doll. I didn't know it was going to be so small. And I think that worked for him, even though they had like the keyword searches where he had requested like a teen doll or a mini teen doll and things like that. So so there's that. There's also Queensland and South Australia have state-based laws, and there's a few other countries and a few American states that have laws criminalizing this. Some countries, I think they just kind of expanded the child pornography or child sexual abuse material laws to include this, or the obscenity laws to include it. So they may not have like specific laws for this. But at Collective Shout, one of the campaigns we really want to get going is to get some global uniform legislation on this. So it's not just like some countries are doing something and others are not. And we know as well that manufacturers and buyers are sort of exploiting these laws, like where there are holes in the legislation. They say, okay, well, I'll drive to this state and pick it up. And then they find ways around it if there's not really strong legislation, but they are deterred when there is strong legislation. Like when there are laws that are strong and they're kind of like, oh, we can't do it now. And they get mad. So it's like, well, they do actually serve to dissuade these men, which is good, but it's not enough unless they're consistent and sort of everywhere.
Right. So then if they're not having access to these dolls, are they then using obviously other alternative means to offend? Like, I guess there's probably no data on that, right?
Yeah. But what I will say is some of these men, and this is from what I've seen on like online forums, pedophile forums, forums attached to child sex abuse doll websites, things like that. They do come up with some pretty creative ways of trying to get around these laws. So some of them say just ship it in parts, or ship it with sort of fake, like large fake removable breasts, so it doesn't look so childlike and you might get around it, or even to get the doll without penetrable orifices. And here's a video tutorial teaching you how to make your own. So they really do go to great lengths to get these products. So yeah.
I mean, look, if it's not one thing, it's another, right? So I'm sure there must be a way to mitigate all of this. Like, I think there's a question there around the ambiguity of the legislation and what defines a child sex doll, preventing accountability for possession, and wouldn't getting rid of them be more appropriate in terms of legislating against it? So I know there was a debate about regulation versus, outlawing them completely. Well, obviously Australia is different, but what's the kind of argument around that?
So in the academic space, there have been some arguments for regulation for sex dolls in general. So basically this idea that we'll get rid of the bad sex dolls and make better ones. I'm like, I don't know if it works like that, but anyway. So they might say things like, okay, so we criminalize dolls that have some sort of rape setting or something like that, or anything that's childlike or things like that. Do you know what I mean? So the ones that, like, these are obviously, really overtly encouraging violence and rape and abuse, and then say, but the other ones could still be available. Or some people argue that the answer is to make this is ridiculous. That we need like feminist sex robots. So they're sort of, not so sexualized and like pornified kind of aesthetic, like more diverse.
I just went to fembots and like Austin Powers fembots. I'm like, what? Sorry. Come on, I don't think that's the same thing, right?
Yeah, a little bit different. Yeah, so basically arguing, let's make them slightly less sexist, as we create these dolls that exist for men's on-demand sexual use, and that's like really progressive and feminist. So, yeah. Well,
look, I don't actually know what to say to that, but I just think you said something before, and again, this is me being naive, but why wouldn't it be this way? You said something about settings, so you can program these dolls to do things.
So a few years ago,
sorry,
there's a question mark over that, really. So some manufacturers have been claiming, we've made these sex robots and everything, even for like maybe 10 years now or more, and everyone gets all excited, and they're so primitive. They're really not when you think of a sex robot, it's not what you think at all. It's really can't do anything. They can't. Sorry, I'm just going to dial it back. Basically, we have sex dolls and we have robotic sex dolls. So you might have a sex doll body with an animatronic head. So it's still largely the same, but there's just some additional features. So you can be paired to like a smartphone, something, and it might be able to talk a bit or blink or move a little bit. So just very few things. They can't stand up by themselves. They can't walk or anything like that. So they're still very limited. But a few years ago, one manufacturer claimed to have made a robotic doll, or a sex robot, as he called it, with a number of different pre-programmed personalities. So it was basically all of them based on like these kind of porn stereotypes. But one of them, he had named Frigid Farah. And the idea was, this is a woman, well, a replica woman, who doesn't want to have sex, because then the men who really like the idea of forcing a woman or, raping a woman, it's kind of this fantasy that this is a woman that doesn't want to have sex and I get to make her. So it's really, reinforcing these rape fantasies, and again, allowing men to practice. So that was something that did get quite a bit of negative attention. I don't know that product actually really existed, or at least in the way that it was being promoted. But of course, all these possibilities and the potential for the future, and even as these products are being paired with smartphone apps and companion sort of apps and things like that, all these questions do come up, like, what does this look like going forward? What are the possibilities?
Right. Well, I'm curious as to, I guess I can imagine, and I have certain assumptions around kind of what the implications of this means. I'm like, how harmful can it really be? Like, I know myself, when we've had some great conversations on the previous episodes with Maha Melham and Melinda, obviously from Collective Shout, and we were talking about pornification and you know, just how, you know, watching pornography and those types of things is really teaching this next generation the types of behaviors, you know, that's leading into really harmful practices, you know, violence against women, strangulation, those types of things. So the same way we've sort of been talking about these sex dolls. So, but if it's only for these perpetrators, I mean, I guess the argument must be, how bad can it really be, and what's the implications for the community, and, you know, why should we be, you know, getting rid of them, or why should they be illegal? I know that they should be legal, just so we're really clear. But I guess I'm kind of trying to think like somebody who's not invested in this, why this should matter to them potentially.
Well, if we're talking about sex dolls generally, rather than just the childlike dolls, then I regard them as a form of pornography, like an interactive form of pornography. So it's very much this porn aesthetic and this idea of female subordination and objectification and male power and dominance and gratification above all else. So what is happening is men have these replica women, basically, and they do whatever they want with no limitations. They love that these products cannot say no. And this is where they often, a lot of these men prefer dolls to actual women, because they say, well, they can't say no. Basically they're always sexually available. So that's a big selling point for a lot of these men. But we know as well that, you know, not all, but a lot of these men, they do enact violence on their dolls. So they are practicing violence. They're doing things like tying up their dolls, trying to like practicing torture and things like that, and discussing different tactics and techniques. Like one guy, he would practice tying up his doll and he'd be like, oh, this didn't quite work, but now I've done it again. It's almost like he had a female body to practice. This is how I would capture a woman and tie her up and hold her hostage. And now I've had a chance to practice like making sure the knots, she really couldn't move and things like that. So they're actually practicing acts of violence against women, and often, you know, in a way that's sexualized. What they're doing is they're practicing violence against women on a doll that looks and feels like a woman, and then that is reinforced with an orgasm. So the idea that this is not encouraging violence against women or harm to women, when you consider what this actually is, just in and of itself, sex dolls and sex robots, they are replica women. They are an object used in place of women. And so they're really contributing to further objectification and dehumanization of women, when we already have a culture where men's violence against women is out of control. We already have a really serious problem with men's violence against women. And instead of challenging the objectification of women and, you know, looking at women's humanity and challenging men's entitlement to access to bodies of women and to children, we're going the other way and saying, oh, we need to like accommodate it. We need to find ways for these men to act out all these fantasies they have. So it's really, we're going in the wrong direction. Instead of actually taking any meaningful action in defense of women's humanity and against the objectification of women that is so harmful, we're reinforcing those very attitudes which we know contribute to men's violence against women.
I just have, my brain just boggles at this whole idea. Is there any like case, because we often do this when we're talking about child sexual abuse as well, as we kind of forget about female offenders. Is there any kind of information about potentially how women are using child sex dolls and things like that? Is it happening?
I've never come across one myself. That doesn't mean that they aren't out there, but I've only ever encountered men who are interested in these products, and they obviously are marketed towards men. The penetrable orifices and all these things are designed to be for a man with a penis. But I do remember one case where a doll, a child sex abuse doll, was marketed. This was a little boy doll, one of the few examples of a male-bodied child doll, where it was marketed as being for women, and the only product review was from a man named Leon. So it's like, okay, even when they're saying, oh, women might like this, women aren't really stepping up. I don't know that there's any interest.
I just, it's just I don't know, like, you know, we often and it is most often men in statistics. But we often do forget about the female perpetrators, and there's quite a few more than I think we recognize, particularly in the child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material kind of space. So I was a little bit curious, but I didn't think it was marketed for women, but I just had to ask the question. So
as far as I know, there's not really data on that. Maybe more in the future, but
yeah. So, back onto, I just kind of want to go back to this whole misogynistic kind of approach that, is happening around these sex dolls. But just the offending side of it, like, is there much, I mean, these dolls have to get into Australia. Like, is there a lot of this going on in Australia? Like, what's the statistics? Like, have you got numbers? Yeah. How we talk to me about what's going on here now.
Over the last few years, I believe Border Force has said, maybe this is 2 years ago, that there'd been like a 653% increase in them stopping these dolls or finding them. Maybe they might be looking more as well, like at the border and everything. But so there is definitely an increase. Although now with the legislation, I don't know how that's impacted that. Obviously, COVID, there was a big spike in sex doll sales, and I'm not sure how that related to child sex abuse dolls. But these items aren't just, I think maybe people think these are like on the dark web or something. We've exposed these items being advertised and sold on Instagram or Twitter, and all these mainstream global marketplaces like Etsy. We've had a years-long campaign calling on Etsy to get rid of child sex abuse dolls and incest and child abuse themed content. But there's like Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, Wish, any of those that you can kind of think of, there's a good chance that they've sold child sex abuse dolls. We have run campaigns against some of these platforms to get them pulled, but that's how prevalent they are. They are actually sold on these mainstream platforms.
I'm really curious, like, has there been any kind of investigation on, I want to say the survivor's perspective, but perspectives of maybe abuse victims, or how, because I look at some media articles and I look at some of the things that are portrayed through publication and stuff like that, and I find it extremely triggering and upsetting at times. Like, I'm a big girl and I can kind of handle it, but I just wonder what the perspective is and the harm that it's creating to those victims and survivors who are already kind of out there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wonder if it's sort of, I don't know how to phrase this quite right, but if it almost like undermines their experience in some way, like it's trivializes it somehow. I don't know. It's I mean, I'm sure you have more insight on that yourself, but it must be a slap in the face to victims and survivors.
Well, that's probably why I don't know that much about it. And again, I was like, all right, I can read up a whole lot on this before I talk to Caitlin, or I can just kind of play this out, because I really haven't, as I said earlier, gone into this because I found it really quite confronting. But I mean, I'm one survivor of many. I'm sure there's many perceptions about this, but it really does, it can't, like, I don't know a lot about this too, and this is another reason I haven't really explored it, but the whole idea of minor attracted persons, right? MAPS. And I know that's probably like a whole other podcast episode, but it's one of those things where I understand it, but for me, I'm looking at it and going, how can that be okay? And the way that people kind of group it as in a sexual identity, and grouping it with the LGBTI community, I'm like, and again, that's another episode, right? Like, it's really because I'm part of the LGBTI community, right? So I find it really offensive as well, that would even be considered as part of the community. And I just don't think it's okay. Like, how can any of this be even a conversation as being okay? Like, I get really angry, Caitlin. I get really fucking angry. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Fair enough.
But I guess that's why you're writing the book, right? Oh, actually, it's out now, right? Your book is live and
it is
for sale.
Yeah, it's out, and I did cover a lot of this stuff, and I was angry for most of the time as I wrote the book. I was typing like this, like angry Kermit, fast typing. That was me. Yeah, I think it's this narrative now that's sort of taken hold, is that it's not a choice, that it's like this unchangeable sexual orientation that some people have, and if it's not a choice, then it's like, oh, we can't condemn someone for something they can't control. Therefore, we have to kind of have pedophilia over here separate from child sexual abuse. And that's very much this narrative to try and separate the two. And that's where you get this rebranding of pedophiles as minor attracted persons. It's part of this whole attempt to destigmatize pedophilia. But then where that leads is, well, if pedophiles didn't choose to be sexually attracted to children, they're kind of victims too, so they should be allowed to access virtual child sexual abuse material and child sex abuse dolls. And it becomes this way of justifying and legitimizing these men's sexual access to CSAM. And it's just a lot of these arguments, maybe some genuine people are really looking for solutions and thinking, I believe mistakenly, that these could be solutions. I think many more of these arguments are not coming from a place of concern for children's well-being, but they're really just coming from these men out of their own self-interest. They want to preserve their access to these products, so they frame it as, under the guise of child well-being and child protection, and then say to feminists like me who object, oh, you're just a moral purity campaigner. Aren't you concerned with preventing abuse? You just want to prevent men from having sex how they want and things like that. Or so it's this very much sort of deflecting, like everyone who disagrees, anyone who objects to this idea of child sex abuse dolls, they're just bigoted or wanting to sexually police others or something. And it's like, wait a minute. But yeah, so I very much think it's an effort to preserve these men's access to the products. It's not about could we actually prevent abuse with this. It's like, maybe if we say that, people will be more sympathetic or will get away with it that way.
I think there's a thread to be followed almost on legitimizing CSAM, and again, that whole undermining the children in the pictures, the children whose abuse is being recorded in those pictures, and I have a real fucking problem with that. Yep. So I want to know, so this is a bit more of a personal question, but how do you, obviously this is something you've been doing for a little while now, very difficult conversation to be having. How are you doing this? How is this working with you being out talking about this, and what sort of challenges have you come across in having these conversations?
Yeah, it's not easy. I'm lucky that I am surrounded by a great bunch of women at Collective Shout that we can all sort of debrief about these things together. And I guess it's a very safe and validating space. I can say, I've just come across this thing, and they get it. They're not going to be like, yeah, but well, or like trying to defend it. There's that understanding. So it's that safe place. So very lucky to have great people around me. Lots of chocolate. And it was actually really therapeutic to, yeah.
I've got my chocolate right here for the debrief. Yeah.
I found writing the book to be kind of therapeutic because I guess I'd spent a couple of years researching beforehand, and I was so angry and shocked even by some of the things I found, like academics actively arguing in defense of these products, or arguing that men's access to like replica women is like a good thing and should be actively encouraged, and it will be good for everyone. I'm like, for the men maybe, but all these things I was discovering, and some of the articles, some of the arguments were just ridiculous. But I thought, people need to know about this. I have to put it out there. I have to expose it. And yeah, so this book was fueled by my rage. But at the end of it, there's a book. So that's good. But really, it was a way for me to sort of channel my anger into like some kind of action rather than just being angry. It was like you can do something with the anger, and that's I guess for a lot of us, when you've had certain experiences, that's what you do. It's like you need to feel like you're changing things, that you can take the anger or the grief or whatever it is and do something to make things different for the next people who come along.
I feel you, and I so see you in that. I really echo what you're saying in my own work, and again, it's the reason for this podcast. It's so we can have a confronting conversation for the first time about something I don't want to talk about, and make it more normal to open up avenues where it's safe to talk about this stuff, and not to normalize anything about this in terms of the action of having or utilizing sex dolls or anything like that. It really does need to be understood past the superficial kind of like, oh, it's going to help men with their sexual desires to children, and that means they're not going to touch a child or whatever. Hell fucking no. We know that this is, I look at them like it's the gateway drug, right? But as you said, and I think it's really, really important to note that they're already offending. They're already usually, got libraries full of child sexual abuse material, which is depicting the horrific acts of abuse against contact abuse against children. And we have to remember, this is a step up. And I'm just trying to summarize a little bit of what you're saying. We do have some questions from our live listeners, so we're going to tap into that shortly. But I'll just get your book back up again. So guys, if you would like a copy of Caitlin's book, Sex Dolls, Robots, and Woman Hating, please order. Is there anything you want to tell our listeners about your book, Caitlin?
I've been advised people should read it in small chunks rather than in one.
Good to know. Yeah, so grab a copy of that, guys. We're just going to jump into some of the questions here that we've got from our live audience. So the first one, Caitlin, we've got is, how might the ability to customize dolls to the preferences of these men create avenues for the replication of the physical features of a real victim child?
Yes, so basically these men have the option of customizing dolls in the likeness of someone known to them, or it could be, obviously everyone has smartphones these days. You can take photos in public. So it could be a child out on the street and someone's taken a photo. So it basically means that these men have the ability to commission a doll based on a specific child. And I have come across in my research men who have done that, who have got a doll based on someone known to them. I remember one case where it was a man referring to a little girl in his care. I'm not sure if it was maybe a niece or something like that. It was a little bit unclear. But he talked about how he got this doll that looked like this little girl in his care, how he would dress it up in clothing that she would wear, so just to sort of heighten the effect. And it was this whole idea that he could just, use the doll, and that would be his way of fantasizing about raping and sexually abusing this little girl. And this was, welcomed and encouraged by the other men in the pedophile forum. But the idea that children are not harmed by this, that this is an alternative to harming children, that doesn't stack up for me. I'm sorry, was there more to that question that I didn't quite get?
No, it's really, yeah, it's we've kind of, I think, covered it a little bit in the conversation anyway. Yeah, so I think you've covered that one. So we'll just go. So the next one is infatuation leading to this form of sexual abuse, then leading to other forms of abuse.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's definitely some men who are infatuated with specific girls, and actually something we've seen at Collective Shout, we have a campaign against Instagram for their hosting of child sexual exploitation content, so-called child influencers, little girls who are models on Instagram. Yeah. Kennedy was recently on Four Corners speaking about child influencers and how they're targeted and preyed on Instagram. But we know some of these men on these social media platforms like Instagram, they're collecting these images of girls and they're trading them in these sort of pedophile forums, and they're really infatuated with these girls, and they have their favorites. And there was actually an article in The Guardian last month, I believe, which said that now with the onset of, or the easy availability of AI tools, what a lot of these men are now doing is saying, well, we want more content of this specific girl that I'm really infatuated with, that I'm obsessed with. So now I'll take what I have, and with AI, I'll create new content of this child. So it is facilitating new ways for these men to offend and exploit these children. And yeah, when you get the AI and the child sex abuse dolls, the ways that men can, facilitate the exploitation and abuse of children, it's exponentially growing, all the possibilities.
Yeah, which I'm very aware of in the lab that I work in. So I work in the artificial intelligence for law enforcement and community safety is my other job. And yeah, that's something we're talking about all the time. And for those who are listening, any any CSAM created with artificial intelligence is still CSAM. It is still illegal to have, to possess, to share, all those types of things. So just because it's being computer generated, it's still being generated from real child images of a child that's been exploited. So it's helpful, I think, to keep that in mind. But yeah, so I was going to say this later, but I'll say it now because it kind of fits. But next episode, we have Lynn Swanson-Kennedy, also from Collective Shout, who will be talking about exactly what we have just discussed briefly there. So that's very exciting. So please make sure that you guys tune in a fortnight's time for that conversation. So that'll be really cool. We do have just 2 more questions. So is better robots really the solution here? Is there such a thing as a feminist sex doll?
I'm going to say a big no. But these are the arguments that are being had in academia, like, oh, sex robots are bad and sexist and contribute to violence against women. Let's make them slightly less sexist, and that will be better. Or, like I said, more diverse body types. Or yeah, so these it's ridiculous.
Like, I don't get it. I don't understand. I'm sorry.
Well, maybe it's a lack of imagination. Just thinking we couldn't possibly, deny men access to sex dolls and sex robots, because if men have some sort of sexual desire, it must be accommodated, obviously. Otherwise, they're oppressed. And these are arguments that I've legitimately read on this topic, arguing about sexual inequality, and what that's talking about is men's lack of access to sex whenever they want it. So I'm like, oh, that's the real problem here. So yeah, obviously that's just rubbish. The idea that there's like a feminist way to create replica women available for men's on-demand sexual use, and that's like advancing women's rights or humanity or something. So it doesn't make sense at all.
If you're listening to this episode on the podcast and not the live show, my face right now, I just keep looking at myself going, oh my God. Like, I get in trouble for my Zoom face all the time because it kind of speaks 1,000 words, but I'm just like, what the fuck? Next time you go to any kind of like academic thing where they're talking about this, can I please come with you? Because I just want to be able to slap them in the face and be like, what the fuck are you on? Like, I'll be just sitting there just going, you'll be like, get her out of here. No, let's not have that conversation. Yeah. All right. The last question is, if women's objects are seen as interchangeable, it begs the question, what do these men consumers truly believe women are here for?
That's exactly it. That's exactly the point. Because if men believe that women and sex dolls are interchangeable, or even that sex dolls are better than actual women, then it tells us a lot about how they see women. They see us as objects, and our primary use is being sexually penetrated, basically. That is what we're for. It doesn't matter if we can't speak, if we can't think, if we have no autonomy or anything else. They just need, that's what they're looking for, sexual availability. And that conveys a lot. And when you get these academics as well who are arguing, for men's access to sex dolls and sex robots, it's like you're telling us as well how you see women when you're saying, oh, for these men who don't have partners, who are lonely or isolated, or men with disabilities, like, you're conveying to us exactly how you see women, and that you think women are interchangeable with rubber dolls with holes. So it's really, the misogyny is just so off the charts.
Yeah, I had a look at one of the posts, and I was very concerned with the whole consent kind of issue and how this is so oppressive towards women. And I think there was something about basically they don't want them to speak, they don't want them to say anything, they just want to basically like a replica pilot. And the other part was that they often form relationships with these dolls, and so if they're treating these dolls with such abuse and torture, and they're kind of bonded to this doll, which could be a replica of a child, or whatever, and they're acting out this stuff, and then what are they actually going to be like with the real person, and how are they going to be acting with I'm sorry, my brain boggles. You probably can see the smoke coming out of my ears. Like I may consume this entire block of, if anyone wants to bribe me, it's fruit and nut Cadbury chocolate. Okay, it's my favorite. I may have a red wine after this with some chocolate, because it's I guess, look, and I want to thank you, Caitlin, because I again, and I'm very honest, I don't sugarcoat anything, and I just say it how it is, and if I don't know, I don't freaking know, right? But I've not actually had a conversation about this, and I just want to say thank you for being so generous in allowing me to kind of explore and dig into some rabbit warrens. I'm sure there's so much more that we can sort of be covering in this space. I know I have like 1,000 more questions, but we're gonna run out of time. So I just want to say thank you for being here and just allowing me to kind of be a little bit naive. Like I said, I'm usually all over it, but I just appreciate the opportunity to kind of get angry with you. So
I love that too. It's great.
Yeah, maybe I need to call you so I can tap into my rage and finish my other books.
Done.
Melinda said there, this book was fueled by my rage. Best driver, love it. Yeah. So okay, guys. So thank you, Caitlin. I'm just going to get the girls to just pop up. If you do not have a copy of Reclaim Your Freedom, you can grab that. It's 8 cycle-breaking strategies for survivors of child sexual abuse. Please feel free to dig into that. I've had have it on good authority that it's okay. It's got some good stuff and very helpful if you have a lived experience of CSA, particularly familial abuse. It really does kind of break down some powerful strategies. So jump in and grab that, guys. As I said before, we've got the amazing Lynn Swanson Kennedy. She's also part of Collective Shout. She'll be jumping on our next episode to talk about kidfluencers and whatever else we come up with. I'm sure there's quite a bit there. So please join us for that. And again, thank you, Caitlin, for being here. Guys, thank you for being part of the live audience, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.